So hello everyone, I am Advait and today we'll be looking at the second part of the second chapter of Class 8 Geography. So as I said, in this chapter the first thing that we'll be covering is about water. So in this topic of water we'll be covering three things. We'll be talking about the various facts about water, how well they are available and how they are not available in some regions, and the conservation of water. So let's start. First, let's look at a few facts. The first thing is the Earth is 3.5 billion years old. Now, I know कि मैंने अपने series में बताया था कि it's 10,000 million years, and the thing is you cannot pinpoint an exact time or date when the Earth was created because no one knows that. So there are a lot of various claims about how old the Earth is, but according to your textbook, it is 3.5 billion, and so write that statistic when it comes in the exam. Don't write 10,000 million years, okay? Just write 3.5 billion years. The second thing is 2/3 of the Earth is water. 2/3, that is about somewhere about 60% is completely water. The next thing is, out of this 60% of water that we have on Earth, only 2.7% is fresh water. Now, what do I mean by fresh water? When we talk about water in large sums, there are two types. We talk about fresh water and we talk about salt water. Salt water is that type of water which has a high concentration of salt. So you might have heard the name the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is the largest saltwater lake in the entire world, which means it has a high concentration of salt. So if you'll see, if you have the time, check out a few videos, because people who go to the Dead Sea, if they try to swim, they cannot drown because the concentration of the salt is so high that people start floating automatically. So we have two types of water bodies, fresh and salt. Salt water bodies are the ones which have a high concentration of salt, and this is not fit for consumption because remember, a lot of common salt or NaCl is not good for our body, and so we cannot consume water from these salt water bodies. But we can consume fresh water. They do not have a high concentration of water, and so those are the two types of water. But this fresh water is only 2.7%, whereas 97.3% is completely salt water on Earth. But even in this 2.7%, 70% is ice. So you might have heard of the term ice age, right? So ice age में क्या हुआ था? There was a large amount of water which slowly started freezing up, and polar ice caps, glaciers, all of these are various remnants of that ice age, and 70% of the fresh water froze during that period, and hence 70% of the water is not accessible to us because it's in the form of ice. And it is, even though it's 2.70% out of 2.7%, it might not seem like a large number, but it is huge when we compare it to ourselves. When we compare it to our size, it is huge, and hence it is impossible to melt all of that water and use it. Even though there are a few agencies which work on using that ice to produce water, it is not humanly possible to melt all of that water. So 70% of fresh water is inaccessible, that is ice. Only 0.8% of the entire world's water is accessible. And so from this we understand that water is very scarce. Water is not easily available, and even if it is not in the form of fresh water. Another case that we have to look at is, even if water is available, it is not available as pure water. It is often found with a lot of solutes such as mud or any other pollutants. Such is the case in the waters of places like Africa. Long years of climate change have turned African water into polluted water, and so the water which is present in these regions is not useful. The second thing is, in desert regions, water is obviously not available. But keep in mind, when I say deserts, I mean two things. I mean both dry deserts as well as the snowy ones. So I mean both. I mean the dry and I mean snow deserts. Basically, what is a desert? A desert is a place which is deserted. And what is a deserted place? Where nothing is available. And so any place where nothing is available, that place is directly called a desert. Usually when we think of desert, na hame yaad aata hai sand and cactus probably. But that is not the exact definition of a desert. The sandy ones that we see are called dry deserts, and the snowy deserts are basically places like Leh and Ladakh, where there's complete snow, no growth of plants. So in desert areas, a lot of water is not available because in the snowy deserts, all of the water has been converted into ice and snow, whereas in the dry deserts, there is no body, there is no lake present at all. So from that we understand that even if water is available, it is not available in its purest form. So now, by understanding all of this, the main thing that we have to look at is the conservation of water. We have looked at the fact that water is very scarce and that even if it's available, it's not available in its purest form. And so we have to use this water very carefully. And using this water carefully according to our needs is called the conservation of water. So the first step in conservation of water is the treatment of effluents. So what are effluents? Effluents are basically pollutants which are released from factories. So usually factories में क्या करते हैं, if there are any pollutants or if there is any waste material, it is usually dumped into rivers, or sometimes even if it's released naturally in the air or on the land, it slowly becomes a part of something called a water cycle and it mixes with the water, hence polluting the water. So the first step in conservation, what we should do is, water which is near these factory areas needs to be treated. Treatment matlab not healthcare medical treatment, we mean treatment and detoxification. We remove all the pollutants and the toxic material from the water over there. So that is the treating of effluents. Effluents are what? Basically pollutants. Next, we have to increase forest cover. Now, how does increasing of forest do anything to the conservation of water? Well, say this is your piece of land and it rains a lot here, let's say. And what happens is, because this land is inclined, let's say it rains here on the higher altitude, all of this water directly flows down. And after flowing down, it becomes a part of another river stream or another river's line, and because of that, it gets polluted in the process. And that is problematic. So, what if I plant a few trees over here? What that does is it stops the water from moving. And when it stops the water here, it gets seeped into the soil. And if it gets seeped into the soil, it is useful for the plants in that area. And hence, we are conserving that water because we are making it useful for the plants in that area. So, that is our second step in conservation, increasing forest cover. It stops water from being drained away into polluted sources. The third point is something called sprinkler irrigation. If you've seen gardens, you'll see these small mechanical sprinklers, or even if your school has a garden of some sort, you'll see those small sprinklers connected to a pipe and they're rotating and they're sprinkling water. Why are they used? Because A, they reduce manual work, and second is they only release a certain amount of water which is necessary for the plants. That it releases water in very small quantities. And because of that, only the water which is necessary in that area is used. The third is drip or trickle irrigation. In drip irrigation, what they do is they use tiny pipes and they make holes in those pipes such that the water that flows in these pipes directly drips into the soil near to the root. So because of that, what happens is, now imagine you have water falling in some region and it stagnates on that piece of land. तो क्या होता है उस वजह से most of that water gets evaporated. Instead of getting absorbed into the soil, it gets evaporated. And that becomes a problem because there will be water scarcity in that area, obviously, because all of that water is being evaporated. So to avoid that evaporation of water in areas where water is not necessarily highly available, you have to use drip or trickle irrigation. So those are the methods of conserving or saving water. So let's have a recap of everything that we've looked at in this section of the chapter. We discussed a few facts about water, how the earth is 3.5 billion years old, how 2/3 of the earth is water, yet only 2.7% is fresh water, out of which 70% is inaccessible. After that, we looked at how even if this water is accessible, it is not found in its purest form, that is in places like Africa. Next, we looked at how it's not at all available in deserts. Here in deserts, we talk about two things: dry and snowy deserts. And finally, when we talk about the conservation, we looked at four different methods: treating of effluents, that is, treating of pollutants, or detoxification. Next is increasing forest cover, increasing the amount of forest land that is there so that the water is stopped from being accessed by polluted streams. Third is sprinkler irrigation, where you use those mechanical devices called sprinklers to irrigate that area only how much to the necessity of that area. And final is drip irrigation in areas where there is a scarcity of water, where water cycle does not regularly take place. Water is directly seeped to the roots such that nothing is stagnated on the land and such that nothing evaporates. So that is the concept of water. So the next topic that we'll be looking at is vegetation and wildlife. In this, we'll be discussing three things. First is the basics of vegetation and wildlife. Second, we'll be talking about the distribution of vegetation. And finally, we'll be talking about the conservation and saving of various forms of vegetation and wildlife. So let's start. Basics. In the basics, we talk about two things. First is, what is a biosphere? So the point of contact, it is defined like this: point of contact between the lithosphere, hydrosphere and atmosphere. That is the combination of all these three. That what is lithosphere? Lithosphere is basically your land. Hydrosphere, what is hydrosphere? Hydrosphere is basically water. And atmosphere is your air. So the contact and combination of all of these three is referred to as the biosphere. So basically the earth is a biosphere, you could say, because it's a contact point of water, air and land. So the next thing is ecosystem. In a biosphere where these three things, water, air and land, combine, creatures depend on each other. So when we look at things like a food chain, for example, the growth or the presence of one creature affects the life of another creature. And that is called an ecosystem, where in the biosphere, various species depend on each other. And that natural system of dependency is called an ecosystem. Now, usually throughout the years, this ecosystem is being affected because of humans. And that has led to the lack or the decrease in the number of various species and a disruption in the ecosystem, which we'll be talking about in the conservation of species. But before that, we have to talk about the distribution of vegetation. What is vegetation? Vegetation is basically the plant growth, plant cover. Basically, when we say vegetation, we mean plants, whereas wildlife means animals. So vegetation means flora, whereas wildlife means fauna, which is plants and animals. So in distribution, we'll be talking about the distribution of vegetation around the world. So there are four different regions in the world when we talk about the spread of vegetation. First are forests. Yes, forests are basically those places where tall trees grow. Those are called forests. And forests are usually categorized by the high presence of water. A lot of rain takes place in this area. The second are grasslands. Grasslands are basically plain areas where tall trees do not grow, but short, tiny sort of shrubs grow. It's basically plain land. So that is the concept of a grassland. Next we talk about our scrubs. Scrubs are basically where they are very dense and compact regions where thorny bushes and shrubs grow. And those regions are called scrubs because they have that compact arrangement of various sorts of wild vegetation. Finally is tundra. A tundra is basically where there is complete lack of any sort of vegetation, where there is complete snow. Those regions are referred to as tundra regions. So those are the four regions in which vegetation is distributed: forests, grasslands, scrubs and tundras. Now finally, what we have to understand is due to different activities of humans and sometimes even nature, the ecosystem is being affected. The balance of the dependency itself is being affected. This can be because of three causes. First is natural. Yes, natural calamities such as landslides, floods, forest fires. All of these can often result in the mass deaths of various species, and hence natural causes often lead to a disturbance in the ecosystem. The second is poaching. What is poaching? Poaching is basically the large amount of hunting of animals for any of their body parts. So when we talk about elephants, for example, their tusks are used to produce ivory. So many people, they hunt elephants for the production of ivory from their tusks, and hence that comes under poaching. The third is other human causes and other human things. So things like climate change, for example, are happening because of human negligence and because of human acts. So things which affect the nature but are actually indirectly done by humans, those are the human causes of the disturbance in the ecosystem. So there are three causes: the natural cause, which is natural calamities; second is poaching, which is unnecessary hunting of animals for any of their body parts, for example elephants and their tusks; and final is human causes, how human activities have led to a disruption in nature. Now finally, yes, these are all the causes, but what are the solutions to all of this is what we need to pay close attention to. There are four solutions when we talk about the solutions to conserve wildlife. The first are parks and sanctuaries, wildlife parks and sanctuaries. So what they do in these areas is they build a perimeter, they build an area in which there is a natural ecosystem already growing, and the government takes its best effort to protect that ecosystem and to protect that region, and that becomes a national park, similar with wildlife sanctuaries. So basically government protected areas where there's a natural growth of an ecosystem. Next is awareness programs. Various awareness programs and festivals in India as well, or occasions in India as well, such as Van Mahotsav, are celebrated. Why? For the awareness of the development of vegetation, for the growth of plants. So various awareness programs have taught people not to touch vegetation and wildlife because they lead to a disruption in the ecosystem. And all of this that we're studying here comes under this only. It comes under awareness, because we are learning about various vegetation and wildlife and how to conserve them, and hence we are becoming aware of these concepts. Next is laws. The government makes a few specific laws specific to animals, that they cannot be hunted, and even if they're hunted, only on a minute, very small scale, which is an exception, of course. In case of India, things like leopards, tigers, lions, all of these cannot be hunted. In fact, most of the animals present in India cannot be hunted, except with the exception of obviously domestic animals such as hens. Finally, is an organization or a pact or an agreement called CITES, or CITES. What is the full form? It is the Convention of International Trade in Exotic Species of Wild Flora and Fauna. So it's basically like an agreement between different countries. They've come together and they've agreed that they are going to spread awareness about all of these issues, and more importantly protect all of the wildlife and vegetation present in their area. So it is basically a convention or an agreement. So that is the concept of how we conserve wildlife and vegetation. So what did we look at here? First, we looked at the basics of vegetation and wildlife, where we spoke about the biosphere. What is a biosphere? Biosphere is basically the contact point of the hydrosphere, lithosphere and atmosphere, that is water, land and air. Next, what we spoke about was the ecosystem. How in this biosphere, for example, Earth is a biosphere. In a biosphere, various species depend on each other for their survival. Next, we looked at the distribution of vegetation. Forests, where trees are very tall and where there is high amount of rain. Grasslands, where the land is completely flat and there is a lot of rain. Next are scrubs, where you find thorny bushes and shrubs and the rain is very low. And finally is tundra areas, which are basically snowy deserts, as I mentioned when I was talking about water, completely snow areas. Next, we spoke about conservation. What are the causes of the disruption in the ecosystem? First are natural causes, natural calamities. Second is poaching, unnecessary hunting of animals for any of their body parts. That is, example is elephants for ivory in their tusks. And final is human causes which have led to a disruption in the ecosystem, which is basically an indirect cause. And finally, we spoke about solutions. How do we conserve vegetation and wildlife? We build parks and sanctuaries which are protected areas by the government. Next are awareness programs such as Van Mahotsav and this entire chapter itself. Next are specific laws introduced in that country on the hunting of and poaching of various animals. And finally is the CITES, which is an agreement between countries, that is the Convention of International Trade in Exotic Species of Wild Flora and Fauna. So these are the things that we looked at while speaking of vegetation and wildlife. And so with the completion of this topic, we have completed the second chapter in geography. So I hope that you understood the concept very well. And if you have any doubts, please let me know in the comment section down below. And I'll see you in chapter 3 of geography. So stay tuned for that one. So if you enjoyed the video, then please make sure to like and subscribe and click the bell icon to remain notified. If you know someone who is interested in videos like these, then please do share these videos with them. And I'll see you in the next one.